This is a continuation of The Big Time by Fritz Leiber, comprising chapters 14 through 16, and the end. Chapter 14. Now will you talk? Like diamonds, we are cut with our own dust. Webster. Cretins have eyes under their back hair, or let's face it, entertainers aren't soldiers. KB weaved to one side and flicked a helpful hand, and poor old Maud went where she'd been going to send KB. It sickened me to see the gravity take hold and yank her down. I could have jumped up and made it 4 in a row for KB, but I'm not a bit brave when things like my life are at stake. Lily was starting to get up, acting a little dazed. KB gently pushed her down again and quietly said, "Where is it?" and then hauled off and slapped her across the face. What got me was the matter-of-fact way KB did it. I can understand somebody getting mad and socking someone, or even deliberately working up a rage so as to be able to do something nasty. But this cold-blooded way turns my stomach. Lily looked as if half her face were about to start bleeding, but she didn't look dazed anymore, and her jaw set. KB grabbed Lily's pearl necklace and twisted it around her neck, and it broke, and the pearls went bouncing around like ping-pong balls, so KB yanked down Lily's gray silk bandeau until it was around the neck and tightened that. Lily started to choke through her tight-pressed lips. Eric, Mark, and Illy had come up and crowded around, but they seemed to be content with the job KB was doing. "Listen, slut," she said. "We have no time. You have a healing room in this place. I can work the things." Here it comes, I thought, wishing I could faint. On top of everything, on top of death even, they had to drag in the nightmare personally stylized for me, the horror with my name on it. I wasn't going to be allowed to blow up peacefully. They weren't satisfied with an A-bomb. They had to write my private hell into the script. "There is a thing called an inverter," KB said exactly as I'd known she would, but as I didn't really hear it just then. A mental split I'll explain in a moment. It opens you up so they can cure your insides without cutting your skin or making you bleed anywhere. It turns the big parts of you inside out, but not the blood tubes. All your skin, your eyes, ears, nose, toes, all of it, becoming the lining of a little hole that's half filled with your hair. Meantime, your insides are exposed for whatever the healer wants to do to them. You live for a while on the air inside the hole. First, the healer gives you an air that makes you sleep, or you go mad in about 50 heartbeats. We'll see what 10 heartbeats do to you without the sleepy air. Now, will you talk? I hadn't been listening to her, though, not the real me, or I'd have gone mad without getting the treatment. I once heard Doc say your liver is more mysterious and farther away from you than the stars, because although you live with your liver all your life, you never see it or learn to point to it instinctively, and the thought of someone messing around with that intimate yet unknown part of you is just too awful. I knew I had to do something quick. Hell, at the first hint of introversion, before KB had even named it, Illy had winced so that his tentacles were all drawn up like fat feather sausages. Eric had looked at him questioningly, but that lousy loony had unendeared himself to me by squeaking, "Don't mind me, I'm just sensitive. Get on with the girl, make her tell." Yes, I knew I had to do something. And here on the floor that meant thinking hard and in high gear about something else. The screwball sculpture Eric had tried to smash was a foot from my nose, and I saw a faint trail of white stuff where it had skidded. I reached out and touched the trail. It was finely gritty, like powdered glass. I tipped up the sculpture, and the part on which it had skidded wasn't marred at all, not even dulled. The gray spheres were as glisteningly bright as ever, so I knew the trail was diamond dust rubbed off the diamonds in the floor by something even harder. That told me the sculpture was something special, and maybe Doc had had a real idea in his pickled brain when he'd been pushing the thing at all of us and trying to tell us something. He hadn't managed to say anything then, but he had earlier when he'd been going to tell us what to do about the bomb, and maybe there was a connection. I twisted my memory hard and let it spring back, and I got inverse Bosch. Bosch, indeed. Bosch and inverse Bosch to all boozers, Rusky or otherwise. So I quick-tried the memory trick again, and this time I got glovsh. And then I grasped and almost sneezed on diamond dust as I watched the pieces fit themselves together in my mind like a speeded-up movie reel. It all hung on that black right-hand hussar's glove Lily had produced for Bruce. Only she couldn't have found it in stores, because we'd searched every fractional pigeonhole later on, and there hadn't been any gloves there. Not even the left-hand mate there would have been. Also, Bruce had had 2 left-hand gloves to start with, and we had been through the whole place with a fine-tooth comb, and there had been only the 2 black gloves on the floor where Bruce had kicked them off the bar. Those 2, and those 2 only. The left-hand glove he'd brought from outside, and the right-hand glove Lily had produced for him. So a left-hand glove had disappeared. The last I'd seen of it, Lily had been putting it on her tray, and a right-hand glove had appeared, which could only add up to one thing. Lily had turned the left-hand glove into an identical right. She couldn't have done it by turning it inside out the ordinary way, because the lining was different. But as I knew only too sickeningly well, there was an extraordinary way to turn things inside out, things like human beings. You merely had to put them on the inverter in surgery and flick the switch for full inversion. Or you could flick it for partial inversion and turn something into a perfect 3-dimensional mirror image of itself, just what a right-hand glove is of a left. Rotation through the 4th dimension, the science boys call it. I've heard of it being used in surgery on the highly asymmetric Martians, and even to give a socially impeccable right hand to a man who'd lost one by turning an amputated right arm into an amputated left. Ordinarily, nothing but live things are ever inverted in surgery, and you wouldn't think of doing it to an inanimate object, especially in a place where the docs are drunk and the surgery hasn't been used for hundreds of sleeps. But when you've just fallen in love, you think of wonderful, crazy things to do for people. Drunk with love, Lily had taken Bruce's extra left-hand glove into surgery, partially inverted it, and got a right-hand glove to give him. What Doc had been trying to say with his inverse Bosch was invert the box, meaning we should put the bronze chest through full inversion to get at the bomb inside to disarm it. Doc, too, had got the idea from Lily's trick with the glove. What an inside-out tactical atomic bomb would look like, I could not imagine and did not particularly care to see. I might have to, though, I realized. But the fast-motion film was still running in my head. Later on, Lily had decided, like I had, that her lover was going to lose out in his plea for mutiny, unless she could give him a really captive audience. And maybe even then, she had been figuring on creating the nest for Bruce's chicks, and all those other things we'd believed in for a while. So she'd taken the major maintainer and remembered the glove, and not many seconds later, she had set down on a shelf of the art gallery, an object that no one would think of questioning, except someone who knew the gallery by heart. I looked at the abstract sculpture a foot from my nose, at the clustered gray spheres the size of golf balls. I had known that the inside of the maintainer was made up of vastly tough, vastly hard giant molecules, but I hadn't realized they were quite that big. I said to myself, Greta, this is going to give you a major psychosis, but you're the one who has to do it. Because no one is going to listen to your deductions when they're all practically living on negative time already. I got up as quietly as if I were getting out of a bed I shouldn't have been in. There are some things entertainers are good at. And KB was just saying, you go mad in about 50 heartbeats. Everybody on their feet was looking at Lily. Sid seemed to have moved, but I had no time for him except to hope he hadn't done anything that might attract attention to me. I stepped out of my shoes and walked rapidly to surgery. There's one good thing about this hardest floor anywhere, it doesn't creak. I walked through the surgery screen that is like a wall of opaque, odorless cigarette smoke, and I concentrated on remembering my snafu'd nurse's training, and before I had time to panic, I had the sculpture positioned on the gleaming table of the inverter. I froze for a moment when I reached for the inversion switch, thinking of the other time, and trying to remember what it had been that bothered me so much about an inside-out brain being bigger and not having eyes. But then I either thumbed my nose at my nightmare or kissed my sanity goodbye, I don't know which, and twisted the switch all the way over. And there was the major maintainer winking blue about 3 times a second, as nice as you could want it. It must have been working as sweet and steady as ever, all the time it was inverted, except that, being inside out, it had hocused the direction finders. Chapter 15, Lord Spider. Black-legged spiders, with red hearts of hell, Marquise. Jesu. I turned, and Sid's face was sticking through the screen like a tinted bas-relief hanging on a gray wall, and I got the impression he had peered unexpectedly through a slit in an arras into Queen Elizabeth's bedroom. He didn't have any time to linger on the sensation, even if he'd wanted to. For an elbow with a copper band thrust through the screen and dug his ribs, and KB marched Lily in by the neck. Eric, Mark, and Illy were right behind. They caught the blue flashes and stopped dead, staring at the long lost. Eric spared me one look which seemed to say, "So you did it, not that it matters." Then he stepped forward and picked it up and held it solidly to his left side in the double right angle made by fingers, forearm, and chest, and reached for the introversion switch with a look on his face as if he were opening a fifth of whiskey. The blue light died, and change winds hit me like a stiff drink that had been a long, long time in coming, like a hot trumpet note out of nowhere. I felt the changing pasts blowing through me, and the uncertainties whistling past, and ice-stiff reality softening with all its duties and necessities, and the little memories shredding away and dancing off like autumn leaves, leaving maybe not even ghosts behind, and all the crazy moods like Mardi Gras dancers pouring down an evening street. And something inside me had the nerve to say it didn't care whether Greta Forzane's death was riding in those winds because they felt so good. I could tell it was hitting the others the same way. Even battered, tight-lipped Lily seemed to be saying, "You're making me drink the stuff and I hate you for it, but I do love it." I guess we'd all had the worry that even finding and extroverting the maintainer wouldn't put us back in touch with the cosmos and give us those winds we hate and love. The thing that cut through to us as we stood there glowing was not the thought of the bomb, though that would have come in a few seconds more, but Sid's voice. He was still standing in the screen, except that now his face was out the other side and we could just see parts of his gray doubleted back, but, of course, his "Jizu" came through the screen as if it weren't there. At first I couldn't figure out who he could be talking to, but I swear I never heard his voice so courtly obsequious before, so strong, and yet so filled with awe, and an undernote of, yes, sheer terror. "Lord, I am filled from top to toe with confusion that you should so honor my poor place," he said. "Poor say I and mine, when I mean that I have ever busked it faithfully for you, not dreaming that you would ever condescend, yet knowing that your eye was certes ever upon me, though I am but as a poor pinch of dust adrift between the suns. I abase myself. Prithee, how may I serve thee, sir? I know not e'en how most suitably to address thee, Lord, King, Emperor Spider." I felt like I was getting very small, but not a bit less visible, worse luck, and even with the change winds inside me to give me courage, I thought this was really too much, coming on top of everything else. It was simply unfair. At the same time, I realized it was to be expected that the big bosses would have been watching us with their unblinking, beady black eyes ever since we had introverted waiting to pounce if we should ever come out of it. I tried to picture what was on the other side of the screen, and I didn't like the assignment. But in spite of being petrified, I had a hard time not giggling, like the zany at graduation exercises, at the way the other ones in surgery were taking it. I mean the soldiers. They each stiffened up like they had the old ramrod inside them, and their faces got that important look, and they glanced at each other and the floor without lowering their heads, as if they were measuring the distance between their feet and mentally chalking alternate sets of footprints to step into. The way Eric and Kabi held the major and minor maintainers became formal. The way they checked their callers and nodded reassuringly was positively esoteric. Even Illy somehow managed to look as if he were on parade. Then from beyond the screen came what was, under the circumstances, the worst noise I've ever heard. A seemingly wordless, distant-sounding howling and wailing, with a note of menace that made me shake, although it also had a nasty familiarity about it I couldn't place. Sid's voice broke into it, loud, fast, and frightened. "Your pardon, Lord. I did not think. Certes, the gravity. I'll attend to it on the instant." He whipped a hand and half a head back through the screen, but without looking back, and snapped his fingers, and before I could blink, KB had put the minor maintainer in his hand. Sid went completely out of sight then, and the howling stopped, and I thought that if that was the way a Lord Spider expressed his annoyance at being subjected to incorrect gravity, I hoped the bosses wouldn't start any conversations with me. Eric pursed his lips and threw the other soldiers a nod, and the four of them marched through the screen as if they'd drilled a lifetime for this moment. I had the wild idea that Eric might give me his arm, but he strode past me as if I were an entertainer. I hesitated a moment then, but I had to see what was happening outside, even if I got eaten up for it. Besides, I had a bit of the thought that if these formalities went on much longer, even a Lord Spider was going to discover just how immune he was to confined atomic blast. I walked through the screen with Lily beside me. The soldiers had stopped a few feet in front of it. I looked around ahead for whatever it was going to turn out to be, prepared to drop a curtsy or whatever else, bar nothing, that seemed expected of me. I had a hard time spotting the beast. Some of the others seemed to be having trouble too. I saw Doc weaving around foolishly by the control divan, and Bruce and Bo and 7C and Maud on their feet beyond it, and I wondered whether we were dealing with an invisible monster. Ought to be easy enough for the bosses to turn a simple trick like invisibility. Then I looked sharply left where everyone else, even glassy-eyed Doc, was coming to look, into the door sector, only there wasn't any monster there, or even a door, but just City holding the minor maintainer and grinning like when he is threatening to tickle me, only more fiendishly. "Not a move, masters," he cried, his eyes dancing, "or I'll pin the pack of you down, marry and amen I will. It is my firm purpose to see the place blasted before I let this instrument out of my hands again." My first thought was, "Splud, but City is a real actor. I don't care if he didn't study under anyone later than Burbage. That just proves how good Burbage is." Sid had convinced us not only that the real spiders had arrived, but earlier that the gravity in the edge of stores had been a lot heavier than it actually was. He completely fooled all those soldiers, including my swelled-headed victorious little commandant, and I kind of filed away the timing of that business of reaching out the hand and snapping the fingers without looking. It was so good. "Beauregard," Sid called. "Get to the major maintainer and call headquarters, but don't come through door. Mary, go by refresher. I'll not trust a single demon of you in this sector with me until much more has been shown and settled." "City, you're wonderful," I said, starting toward him. "As soon as I got the maintainer unsnarled and looked around and saw your sweet old face—" "Back, tricksy troll. Not the breadth of one scarlet toenail nearer me. You queen of sleights and high priestess of deception," he bellowed. "You least of all do I trust. Why you hid the maintainer, I know not, Faith. But later you'll discover the truth to me or I'll have your gizzard." I could see there was going to have to be a little explaining. Doc, touched off, I guess, by Sid waving his hand at me, threw back his head and let off one of those shuddery Siberian wolf howls he does so blamed well. Sid waved toward him sharply, and he shut up, beaming toothily. But at least I knew who was responsible for the spider wail of displeasure that Sid had either called for, or more likely got as a gift of the gods and used in his act. Bo came circling around fast, and Eric shoved the major maintainer into his hands without making any fuss. The four soldiers were looking pretty glum after losing their grand review. Bo dumped some junk off one of the art gallery's sturdy tabourets and set the major maintainer on it carefully but fast, and quickly knelt in front of it and whipped on some earphones and started to tune. The way he did it snatched away from me my inward glory at my big inversion brainwave so fast, I might never have had it. And there was nothing in my mind again but the bronze bomb chest. I wondered if I should suggest inverting the thing, but I said to myself, Greta, you got no diploma to show them, and there probably isn't time to try two things anyway. Then Eric for once did something I wanted him to, though I didn't care for its effect on my nerves, by looking at his caller and saying quietly, 9 minutes to go, if place time and cosmic time are syncing. Bo was steady as a rock, and working adjustments so fine that I couldn't even see his fingers move. Then, at the other end of the place, Bruce took a few steps toward us. 7C and Maud followed a bit behind him. I remembered Bruce was another of our nuts with a private program for blowing up the place. "Sydney," he called, and then when he'd got Sid's attention, "Remember, Sydney, you and I both came down to London from Peterhouse." I didn't get it. Then Bruce looked toward Eric with a devil-may-care challenge and toward Lily, as if he were asking her forgiveness for something. I couldn't read her expression. The bruises were blue on her throat and her cheek was puffy. Then Bruce once more shot Eric that look of challenge, and he spun and grabbed 7C by a wrist and stuck out a foot. Even half-horses aren't too sharp about infighting, I guess. And the satyr had every right to feel at least as confused as I felt. and sent him stumbling into Maud, and the two of them tumbled to the floor in a jumble of hairy legs and pearl gray frock. Bruce raced to the bomb chest. Most of us yelled, "Stop him, Sid! Pin him down!" or something like that. I know I did because I was suddenly sure that he'd been asking Lily's pardon for blowing the two of them up. And all the rest of us, too. The love-blinded stinker. Sid had been watching him all the time, and now he lifted his hand to the minor maintainer. But then he didn't touch any of the dials, just watched and waited, and I thought, Shaitan shave us. Does Siddy want in on death too? Ain't he satisfied with all he knows about life? Bruce had knelt and was twisting some things on the front of the chest, and it was all as bright as if he were under a bank of Klieg lights, and I was telling myself I wouldn't know anything when the fireball fired, and not believing it. And 7C and Maud had got unscrambled and were starting for Bruce, and the rest of us were yelling at Sid, except that Eric was just looking at Bruce very happily, and Sid was still not doing anything, and it was unbearable except just then I felt the little arteries start to burst in my brain like a string of firecrackers and the old aorta pop, and for good measure, a couple of valves come unhinged in my ticker, and I was thinking, well, now I know what it's like to die of heart failure and high blood pressure, and having a last quiet smile at having cheated the bomb, when Bruce jumped up and back from the chest. "That does it," he announced cheerily. "She's as safe as the Bank of England." 7C and Maud stopped themselves just short of knocking him down, and I said to myself, "Hey, let's get a move on. I thought heart attacks were fast." Before anyone else could speak, Bo did. He had turned around from the major maintainer and pulled aside one of the earphones. "I got headquarters," he said crisply. "They told me how to disarm the bomb. I merely said I thought we ought to know." "What did you do, sir?" he called to Bruce. "There's a row of 4 anks just below the lock. The first to your left you give a quarter turn to the right, the second a quarter turn to the left, same for the fourth, and you don't touch the third." "That is it, sir," Bo confirmed. The long silence was too much for me. I guess I must have the shortest span for unspoken relief going. I drew some nourishment out of my restored arteries into my brain cells and yelled, "Siddy, I know I'm a tricksy troll and the high vixen of all foxes, but what the hell is Peterhouse?" "The oldest college at Cambridge," he told me rather coolly. Chapter 16. The Possibility Binders. Familiar with infinite universe sheafs and open-ended postulate systems, the notion that everything is possible, and I mean everything, and everything has happened, everything. Heinlein. An hour later, I was nursing a weak highball and a black eye in the sleepy-time darkness on the couch farthest from the piano, half watching the highlighted party going on around it and the bar, while the place waited for rendezvous with Egypt and the Battle of Alexandria. Sid had swept all our outstanding problems into one big bundle, and since his hand held the joker of the minor maintainer, he had settled them all as high-handedly as if they'd been those of a bunch of school kids. It amounted to this. We'd been introverted when most of the damning things had happened, so presumably only we knew about them, and we were all in so deep one way or another that we'd all have to keep quiet to protect our delicate complexions. Well, Eric's triggering the bomb did balance rather neatly Bruce's incitement to mutiny, and there was Doc's drinking, while everybody who had declared for the peace message had something to hide. Mark and KB. I felt inclined to trust anywhere, Maud for sure, and Eric in this particular matter, damn him. Illy I didn't feel at all easy about, but I told myself there always has to be a fly in the ointment. A darn big one this time, and furry. Sid didn't mention his own dirty linen, but he knew we knew he'd flopped badly as boss of the place, and only recouped himself by that last-minute flim-flam. Remembering Sid's trick made me think for a moment about the real spiders. Just before I snuck out of surgery, I'd had a vivid picture of what they must look like, but now I couldn't get it again. It depressed me, not being able to remember. Oh, I probably just imagined I'd had a picture, like a hophead on a Secret of the Universe kick. Me ever find out anything about the spiders, except for nervous notions like I'd had during the recent fracas? What a laugh. The funniest thing, ha, was that I had ended up the least trusted person. Sid wouldn't give me time to explain how I deduced what had happened to the maintainer, and even when Lily spoke up and admitted hiding it, she acted so bored I don't think everybody believed her, although she did spill the realistic detail that she hadn't used partial inversion on the glove. She'd just turned it inside out to make it a right, and then done a full inversion to get the lining back inside. I tried to get Doc to confirm that he'd reasoned the thing out the same way I had, but he said he had been blacked out the whole time, except during the first part of the hunt, and he didn't remember having any bright ideas at all. Right now, he was having Maud explain to him twice, in detail, everything that had happened. I decided that it was going to take a little more work before my reputation as a great detective was established. I looked over the edge of the couch and just made out in the gloom one of Bruce's black gloves. It must have been kicked there. I fished it up. It was the right-hand one. My big clue, and was I sick of it? Got mittens, God forbid. I slung it away, and like a lurking octopus, Illy shot up a tentacle from the next couch, where I hadn't known he was resting, and snatched the glove like it was a morsel of underwater garbage. These ETs can seem pretty shuddery non-human at times. I thought of what a cold-blooded, skin-saving louse Illy had been, and about Sid and his easy suspicions, and Eric and my black eye, and how, as usual, I'd got left alone in the end. My men. Bruce had explained about being an A-Tech. Like a lot of us, he'd had several widely different jobs during his first weeks in the Change World, and one of them had been as secretary to a group of the minor atomics boys from the Manhattan Project Earth satellite days. I gathered he'd also absorbed some of his bothersome ideas from them. I hadn't quite decided yet what species of heroic heel he belonged to, but he was thick with Mark and Eric again. Everybody's men. Sid didn't have to argue with anybody. All the wild compulsions and mighty resolves were dead now anyway, until they'd had a good long rest. I sure could use one myself, I knew. The party at the piano was getting wilder. Lily had been dancing the black bottom on top of it, and now she'd jumped down into Sid's and Seven Seas' arms, taking a long time about it. She'd been drinking a lot, and her little gray dress looked about as innocent on her as diapers would on Nell Gwynn. She continued her dance, distributing her marks of favor equally between Sid, Eric, and the satyr. Bo didn't mind a bit, but serenely pounded out "Tonight's the night," which she'd practically shouted to him not 2 minutes ago. I was glad to be out of the party. Who can compete with a highly experienced, utterly disillusioned 17-year-old really throwing herself away for the first time? Something touched my hand. Illy had stretched a tentacle into a furry wire to return me the black glove, although he ought to have known I didn't want it. I pushed it away, privately calling Illy a washed-out moronic tarantula, and right away I felt a little guilty. What right had I to be critical of Illy? Would my own character have shown to advantage if I'd been locked in with 11 octopoids a billion years away? For that matter, where did I get off being critical of anyone? Still, I was glad to be out of the party, though I kept on watching it. Bruce was drinking alone at the bar. Once Sid had gone over to him and they'd had one together, and I'd heard Bruce reciting from Rupert Brooke those deliberately corny lines, "For England's the one land I know, where men with splendid hearts may go, and Cambridgeshire, of all England, the shire for men who understand." And I'd remembered that Brooke, too, had died young in World War I, and my ideas had got fuzzy. But mostly, Bruce was just calmly drinking by himself. Every once in a while, Lily would look at him and stop dead in her dancing and laugh. I'd figured out this Bruce-Lily-Eric business as well as I cared to. Lily had wanted the nest with all her heart and nothing else would ever satisfy her. And now she'd go to hell her own way and probably die of Bright's disease for a third time in the Change World. Bruce hadn't wanted the nest or Lily as much as he wanted the Change World and the chances it gave for soldierly cavorting and poetic drunks. Lily's seed wasn't his idea of healing the cosmos. Maybe he'd make a real mutiny someday, but more likely he'd stick to barroom epics. His and Lily's infatuation wouldn't die completely, no matter how rancid it looked right now. The real love angle might go, but change would magnify the romance angle, and it might seem to them like a big thing of a sort if they met again. Eric had his comrade, shaped to suit him, who'd had the guts and cleverness to disarm the bomb he'd had the guts to trigger. You have to hand it to Eric for having the nerve to put us all in a situation where we'd have to find the maintainer or Fry. But I don't know anything disgusting enough to hand to him. I had tried a while back. I had gone up behind him and said, "Hey, how's my wicked little commandant? Forgotten you're on so whiter." And as he turned, I clawed my nails and slammed him across the cheek. That's how I got the black eye. Maud wanted to put an electronic leech on it, but I took the old handkerchief in ice water. Well, at any rate, Eric had his scratches to match Bruce's, not as deep, but 4 of them. And I told myself maybe they'd get infected. I hadn't washed my hands since the hunt. Not that Eric doesn't love scars. Mark was the one who helped me up after Eric knocked me down. You got any omnias for that? I snapped at him. For what? Mark asked. Oh, for everything that's been happening to us, I told him disgustedly. He seemed to actually think for a moment, and then he said, Omnia mutantur, nihil interit. Meaning? I asked him. He said, all things change, but nothing is really lost. It would be a wonderful philosophy to stand with against the change winds. Also damn silly. I wondered if Mark really believed it. I wished I could. Sometimes I come close to thinking it's a lot of baloney trying to be any decent kind of demon, even a good entertainer. Then I tell myself, that's life, Greta. You've got to love through it somehow. But there are times when some of these cookies are not too easy to love. Something brushed the palm of my hand again. It was Illy's tentacle, with the tendrils of the tip spread out like a little bush. I started to pull my hand away, but then I realized the loon was simply lonely. I surrendered my hand to the patterned gossamer pressures of feather talk. Right away I got the words, feeling lonely, Greta girl? It almost floored me, I tell you. Here I was understanding feather talk, which I just didn't, and I was understanding it in English, which didn't make sense at all. For a second, I thought Illy must have spoken, but I knew he hadn't. And for a couple more seconds, I thought he was working telepathy on me, using the feather talk as cues. Then, I tumbled to what was happening. He was playing English on my palm like on the keyboard of his squeak box, and since I could play English on a squeak box myself, my mind translated automatically. Realizing this almost gave my mind stage fright, but I was too fagged to be hocused by self-consciousness. I just lay back and let the thoughts come through. It's good to have someone talk to you, even an underweight octopus, and without the squeaks, Illy didn't sound so silly. His phrasing was soberer. Feeling sad, Greta girl, because you'll never understand what's happening to us all, Illy asked me. Because you'll never be anything but a shadow fighting shadows, and trying to love shadows in between the battles? It's time you understood we're not really fighting a war at all, although it looks that way. But going through a kind of evolution, though not exactly the kind Eric had in mind. Your Terran thought has a word for it and a theory for it. A theory that recurs on many worlds. It's about the 4 orders of life: plants, animals, men, and demons. Plants are energy binders. They can't move through space or time, but they can clutch energy and transform it. Animals are space binders. They can move through space. Man, Terran or ET, Lunan or non-Lunan, is a time binder. He has memory. Demons are the 4th order of evolution, possibility binders. They can make all of what might be part of what is, and that is their evolutionary function. Resurrection is like the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly. A 3rd order being breaks out of the chrysalis of its lifeline into 4th order life. The leap from the ripped cocoon of an unchanging reality is like the first animal's leap when he ceases to be a plant, and the change world is the core of meaning behind the many myths of immortality. All evolution looks like a war at first. Octopoids against monopoids, mammals against reptiles. And it has a necessary dialectic. There must be the thesis, we call it snake, and the antithesis, spider, before there can be the ultimate synthesis, when all possibilities are fully realized in one ultimate universe. The change war isn't the blind destruction it seems. Remember that the serpent is your symbol of wisdom, and the spider your sign for patience. The 2 names are rightly frightening to you, for all high existence is a mixture of horror and delight. And don't be surprised, Greta girl, at the range of my words and thoughts. In a way, I've had 1 billion years to study Terra and learn her languages and myths. Who are the real spiders and snakes, meaning who were the first possibility binders? Who was Adam, Greta girl? Who was Cain? Who were Eve and Lilith? In binding all possibility, the demons also bind the mental with the material. All 4th order beings live inside and outside all minds, throughout the whole cosmos. Even this place is, after its fashion, a giant brain. Its floor is the brain pan, The boundary of the void is the cortex of gray matter. Yes, even the major and minor maintainers are analogues of the pineal and pituitary glands, which in some form sustain all nervous systems. There's the real picture, Greta girl. The feather talk faded out, and Illy's tendril tips merged into a soft pad on which I fingered. Thanks, Daddy Longlegs. Chewing over in my mind what Illy had just told me, I looked back at the gang around the piano. The party seemed to be breaking up. At least some of them were chopping away at it. Sid had gone to the control divan and was getting set to tune in Egypt. Mark and KB were there with him, all bursting with eagerness and the vision of ranks on ranks of mounted zombie bowmen going up in a mushroom cloud. I thought of what Illy had told me, and I managed to smile. Seems we've got to win and lose all the battles, every which way. Mark had just put on his Parthian costume, groaning cheerfully, trousers again, and was striding around under a hat like a fur-lined ice cream cone, and with the sleeves of his metal-stuffed candies flapping over his hands. He waved a short sword with a heart-shaped guard at Bruce and Eric, and told them to get a move on. KB was going along on the operation wearing the old woman disguise intended for Benson Carter. I got a half-hearted kick out of knowing she was going to have to cover that chest and hobble. Bruce and Eric weren't taking orders from Mark just yet. Eric went over and said something to Bruce at the bar, and Bruce got down and went over with Eric to the piano, and Eric tapped Bo on the shoulder and leaned over and said something to him. And Bo nodded and yanked Limehouse Blues to a fast close and started another piece, something slow and nostalgic. Eric and Bruce waved to Mark and smiled, as if to show him that whether he came over and stood with them or not, the legate and the lieutenant and the commandant were very much together. And while Sevensee hugged Lily with a simple enthusiasm that made me wonder why I've wasted so much imagination on genetic treatments for him, Eric and Bruce sang, "To the Legion of the Lost Ones, to the cohort of the damned, to our brothers in the tunnels outside time, sing 3 change-resistant zombies, raised from death and robot-crammed, and commandos of the spiders. Here's to crime. We're 3 blind mice on the wrong time track. Hush, hush, hush. We've lost our now and we'll never get back. Hush, hush, hush. Change commandos out on the spree, damned through all possibility. Ghost girls, think kindly on such as we. Hush, hush, hush." While they were singing, I looked down at my charcoal skirt and over at Maud and Lily, and I thought, 3 gray hustlers for 3 black hussars. That's our speed. Well, I'd never thought of myself as a high-speed job winning all the races. I wouldn't feel comfortable that way. Come to think of it, we've got to lose and win all the races in the long run, the way the course is laid out. I fingered to Illy, "That's the picture all right, Spider-Boy." The end. Best audiobooks for free hopes that you have enjoyed this production of The Big Time by Fritz Leiber. Please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and Rumble, as your subscription is the support we need to create more great free content. Please look to our website at bestaudiobooksforfree.com for a complete list of our audiobooks.